In the year 1724, in a modest house on the cobblestone streets of Königsberg, Prussia, a child was born who would fundamentally reshape how humanity understands reality itself. His name was Immanuel Kant, and by the time he drew his final breath 80 years later, he had constructed a philosophical system so revolutionary that it forced every thinker who came after him to grapple with questions they had never even thought to ask. This is the story of a man who never travelled more than 60 miles from his birthplace, yet whose mind journeyed to the very limits of human knowledge and back again. But here's what makes Kant's story truly extraordinary. While other philosophers throughout history had claimed to discover truth through pure reason or direct experience, Kant dared to ask a question that seemed almost heretical. What if both approaches were fundamentally flawed? What if the very act of knowing changed what we could know? What if reality itself was split between what exists and what we can actually experience? These weren't just abstract academic puzzles. These were questions that would determine whether human beings could ever truly understand themselves, their world, or their place in the cosmos. Picture this scene. It's a crisp morning in Königsberg, and like every morning for the past several decades, the townspeople set their clocks not by the church bells or the position of the sun, but by the sight of a small, frail man taking his daily constitutional walk. His route never varied, his pace never changed. His punctuality was so legendary that neighbours joked they could regulate their entire lives around this solitary figure making his way through the streets. This was Immanuel Kant at the height of his intellectual powers, and yet to most observers he appeared to be nothing more than an eccentric bachelor professor living the most predictable life imaginable. What those observers couldn't see was the revolutionary storm brewing inside that methodical mind. Behind those pale blue eyes, Kant was systematically dismantling 2,000 years of philosophical certainty and rebuilding human knowledge from the ground up. He was asking questions that would make kings tremble and priests lose sleep, questions about the nature of freedom, the source of moral obligation, the possibility of God's existence, and the ultimate destiny of the human race. These weren't merely intellectual exercises for Kant. They were matters of life and death, salvation and damnation, progress and stagnation for all of humanity. Before we dive into this extraordinary intellectual journey, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything to me, and I'm genuinely curious to know where in the world you're watching from and what drew you to learn about one of history's most influential yet challenging thinkers. Drop a comment below and let me know which aspect of Kant's philosophy interests you most. And now, settle in as we travel back to 18th century Prussia to witness the birth and development of a mind that would change everything. Königsberg in 1724 was a city caught between worlds. Officially part of Prussia, it retained the character of its origins as a fortress town established by the Teutonic Knights centuries earlier. The city sat on the banks of the Pregel River, its medieval walls and Gothic spires creating a skyline that spoke of ancient traditions and enduring values. Trade flowed through its ports, connecting the Baltic regions with the broader European economy. Universities and churches dominated the intellectual landscape, while craftsmen and merchants filled the bustling markets with the sounds of commerce and conversation. Into this world, on April 22nd, came Immanuel Kant, the fourth child of Johann Georg Kant and Anna Regina Kant. His father was a harness maker, a craftsman who worked with his hands to create the leather goods essential for transportation in an age when horses provided the primary means of moving people and cargo across the countryside. It was honest work, respectable work, but it was not the kind of occupation that typically produced world-changing philosophers. The Kant family lived modestly, their small house reflecting the economic realities of artisan life in early 18th century Prussia. But if the Kant household lacked material wealth, it possessed something far more valuable for the development of a future philosopher. Both parents were deeply committed to pietism, a reform movement within Lutheranism that emphasized personal devotion, moral purity, and direct relationship with God over elaborate theological doctrine or ecclesiastical hierarchy. Pietists believed that true Christianity showed itself not in complex theological arguments, but in transformed lives, in practical acts of love and service, and in the cultivation of inner spiritual discipline. Anna Regina Kant, Immanuel's mother, embodied these pietist ideals with remarkable consistency. Neighbours and family members would later remember her as a woman of extraordinary moral character, someone who approached every aspect of daily life with a sense of duty and devotion that left lasting impressions on everyone who knew her. She possessed what her son would later describe as a natural nobility of character, an intuitive grasp of right and wrong that needed no complex philosophical justification. For young Immanuel, his mother became the first and most powerful example of moral law made manifest in human life. The pietist influence extended far beyond the Kant household. Anna Regina had become acquainted with Franz Albert Schultz, a prominent pietist pastor and professor at the University of Königsberg. Schultz recognized exceptional potential in the young Kant boy and became instrumental in shaping his early education. When Immanuel was 8 years old, Schultz arranged for him to attend the Collegium Fridericianum, a prestigious pietist gymnasium that combined rigorous classical education with the moral and spiritual formation that defined the movement. The Collegium Fridericianum represented everything that was both admirable and suffocating about pietist education. Students received excellent training in Latin, Greek, mathematics, and natural philosophy. They memorized vast portions of scripture and classical literature. They learned to think systematically and express themselves clearly, but this intellectual rigor came wrapped in an atmosphere of constant moral scrutiny and religious devotion that many students found oppressive. Daily schedules included multiple prayer sessions, regular examinations of conscience, and strict behavioral codes that governed everything from speech patterns to leisure activities. For the young Kant, this educational environment produced a complex mixture of gratitude and rebellion that would shape his entire philosophical project. On one hand, he acquired the intellectual tools and moral seriousness that would enable his later achievements. The pietist emphasis on personal responsibility and inner examination aligned perfectly with his natural temperament. He learned to value duty over pleasure, principle over convenience, and truth over popularity. These were lessons that would echo through every page of his mature philosophical works. On the other hand, the rigid religious orthodoxy and emotional manipulation that often accompanied pietist education left him with a lifelong suspicion of enthusiasm and sentimentality in religious matters. He would later describe his school years as a form of slavery, a system that tried to manufacture genuine piety through external pressure and constant surveillance. The experience convinced him that true moral development had to come from within, from the autonomous exercise of rational will, rather than from external authority or emotional manipulation. The tension between these two aspects of his pietist upbringing would become one of the driving forces behind his philosophical development. How could human beings maintain the moral seriousness and sense of duty that pietism represented while avoiding the authoritarianism and irrationality that seemed to accompany it? How could reason and faith coexist without one destroying the other? These questions would occupy him for the rest of his life. In 1740, at the age of 16, Kant enrolled at the University of Königsberg as a theology student. The choice reflected both family expectations and the practical realities of 18th century career options for intellectually gifted young men from modest backgrounds. The church offered one of the few paths to social advancement, available to someone in Kant's circumstances. A successful clerical career could provide financial security, social respectability, and opportunities for continued learning and teaching. But from almost the moment he arrived at the university, Kant's interests began to drift away from theology toward natural philosophy and mathematics. The University of Königsberg in the 1740s was experiencing an intellectual awakening that reflected broader changes sweeping across European academic life. The scientific revolution was transforming how educated people understood the natural world, while the Enlightenment was beginning to challenge traditional sources of authority in every domain of human experience. Kant's most influential professor during these years was Martin Knutzen, a remarkable figure who managed to combine orthodox Lutheran theology with serious engagement with the latest developments in mathematics, physics, and philosophy. Knutzen introduced his students to the mechanical philosophy of Isaac Newton, the rationalist metaphysics of Gottfried Leibniz, and the empiricist epistemology of John Locke. More importantly, he demonstrated that it was possible to be both intellectually rigorous and religiously devout, both scientifically informed and morally serious. Under Knutsen's guidance, Kant began to see that the apparent conflict between reason and faith might be resolved not by choosing one over the other, but by carefully defining the proper domain of each. Science could explain the mechanical operations of the natural world without threatening the moral and spiritual truths that gave life meaning and purpose. Philosophy could use reason to establish the limits of human knowledge without undermining the foundations of ethics and religion. This insight would eventually blossom into one of the central themes of Kant's mature philosophy. The young university student threw himself into his studies with characteristic intensity and systematic thoroughness. He mastered Latin and developed reading competency in French and English, languages that gave him access to the latest philosophical and scientific literature from across Europe. He studied mathematics with enough seriousness to understand the revolutionary implications of Newton's Principia Mathematica. He read voraciously in history, geography, and natural science, developing the broad intellectual foundation that would later enable him to write authoritatively about everything from astronomy to anthropology. But it was his encounter with the philosophical works of Christian Wolff that proved most decisive for his intellectual development. Wolff had created a comprehensive philosophical system that attempted to demonstrate all important truths through rigorous logical analysis. His approach combined the systematic thoroughness of medieval scholasticism with the mathematical precision that had proven so successful in the natural sciences. For the young Kant, Wolff's example suggested that philosophy could become a genuine science, capable of achieving the same kind of certainty and universal validity that characterized mathematics and physics. However, this early enthusiasm for systematic philosophy would soon encounter a profound challenge that would force Kant to question everything he thought he knew about the nature of human knowledge. In 1747, tragedy struck the Kant household when Anna Regina, his beloved mother, died after a prolonged illness. She was only 40 years old, and her death left an emotional void in Kant's life that would never be completely filled. Years later, he would write that he never forgot her, that her memory continued to inspire his commitment to moral principle, even when the philosophical foundations for that commitment remained unclear. The loss of his mother coincided with his graduation from the university and his first serious engagement with the works of David Hume, the Scottish philosopher whose sceptical arguments would eventually wake Kant from what he later called his dogmatic slumber. But that awakening was still years in the future. For now, the young graduate faced more immediate practical concerns. His father's modest income could no longer support his education, and he needed to find employment that would allow him to continue his intellectual development while earning enough money to survive. Kant made the difficult decision to leave Königsberg and work as a private tutor for wealthy families in the surrounding countryside. This period of his life, from 1747 to 1755, remains somewhat mysterious to historians. We know that he served at least 3 different families, teaching their children mathematics, natural science, geography, and classical languages. We know that he continued his own studies during this period, working on his first philosophical writings and keeping up with the latest developments in European thought. But the details of his daily life during these years have been lost to history. What we can say with certainty is that this experience of relative poverty and social dependence had a profound impact on his character and his philosophy. Kant learned firsthand what it meant to be economically vulnerable, to depend on the goodwill of others for his basic survival. He saw how easily intellectual talent could be wasted when it lacked institutional support and financial security. These experiences would later inform his political philosophy, particularly his arguments about the importance of civil society and the rule of law in protecting individual freedom and dignity. More immediately, the years as a private tutor gave Kant time to develop his own philosophical voice. In 1749, while still working for his first employer, he completed his first major work, Thoughts on the True Estimation of Living Forces. The title refers to a technical dispute in 18th century physics about how to measure the force of moving objects, but the deeper significance lay in Kant's attempt to mediate between competing philosophical approaches to understanding the natural world. Even at this early stage, he was trying to find a middle path between extreme positions, a characteristic that would define his entire intellectual career. The work itself was not particularly original or influential, but it marks the beginning of Kant's lifelong commitment to using philosophy to clarify conceptual confusions and resolve apparent contradictions in human knowledge. He was already showing signs of the methodical, systematic approach that would later revolutionize philosophy. More importantly, he was beginning to suspect that many philosophical problems arose not from the inherent difficulty of their subject matter, but from confusion about the proper methods and limits of philosophical inquiry. In 1755, Kant finally returned to Königsberg to begin his academic career in earnest. He submitted his master's thesis, On Fire, which attempted to explain combustion through the mechanical principles that governed all natural phenomena. The work demonstrated his mastery of contemporary natural philosophy, but it also revealed his growing interest in the deeper questions about the relationship between mind and world, between human concepts and natural reality, that would eventually consume his mature philosophy. More significant was his inaugural dissertation, A New Elucidation of the First Principles of Metaphysical Cognition, which he defended later that same year to earn the right to lecture at the university. This work showed clear signs of the revolutionary thinking that would later emerge in his critical philosophy. Kant was already questioning whether traditional metaphysics could achieve the kind of knowledge it claimed to possess. He was beginning to suspect that human reason had built-in limitations that previous philosophers had failed to recognize or acknowledge. But the most important development during this period was Kant's growing awareness of the profound challenge that David Hume's skeptical arguments posed to all claims about human knowledge. Hume had argued that we cannot justify our beliefs about causation, the external world, or even the existence of the self through either reason or experience. Everything we think we know might be nothing more than habit, custom, and psychological association dressed up in the language of logical necessity. For most philosophers of the time, Hume's arguments were simply too radical to take seriously. They seemed to lead to complete skepticism about the possibility of any genuine knowledge whatsoever. But Kant recognized that Hume had identified a real problem that could not be dismissed through appeals to common sense or traditional authority. If philosophy was to remain a legitimate intellectual enterprise, it would have to find a way to answer Hume's challenge without simply ignoring it. This recognition would eventually lead Kant to his most important insight. Perhaps the problem was not that human knowledge was impossible, but that philosophers had fundamentally misunderstood what knowledge actually involves. Perhaps the mind was not a passive mirror that simply reflected the structure of an independent reality, but an active faculty that helped to construct the very experience it sought to understand. Perhaps the apparent conflict between rationalism and empiricism could be resolved by showing that both approaches captured important truths about different aspects of the knowing process. But these revolutionary ideas were still gestating in the 1750s. For now, Kant was primarily concerned with establishing himself as a competent lecturer and scholar within the existing academic system. He began offering courses on mathematics, natural science, geography, and moral philosophy, quickly developing a reputation as an engaging and knowledgeable teacher who could make complex ideas accessible to students with varying levels of preparation. His lectures on physical geography became particularly popular, drawing students from across the university and even attracting members of the general public who were curious about distant lands and exotic cultures. Kant had never travelled beyond the immediate vicinity of Königsberg, but his voracious reading and systematic study methods allowed him to present remarkably detailed and accurate accounts of places he had never seen. These lectures revealed another important aspect of his intellectual character, his ability to synthesize vast amounts of information from different sources and organize it into coherent, systematic presentations. During the 1760s, Kant entered what scholars now call his pre-critical period, a time of intense philosophical productivity during which he published a series of works that established his reputation as one of the most promising young philosophers in Germany. These writings showed him grappling with the fundamental questions that would eventually lead to his revolutionary, critical philosophy, but they also revealed a thinker who was still working within broadly traditional frameworks and assumptions. His 1763 essay, The Only Possible Argument in Support of a Demonstration of the Existence of God, attempted to provide a new and more rigorous proof of divine existence. But it also contained hints of his growing skepticism about the power of pure reason to establish metaphysical truths. His inquiry concerning the distinctness of the principles of natural theology and morality won a prize from the Berlin Academy of Sciences for its analysis of the differences between mathematical and philosophical methods, but it also revealed his increasing awareness that philosophy could not simply imitate the procedures that had proven so successful in mathematics and natural science. Most significantly, his 1766 work Dreams of a Spirit Seer marked a crucial turning point in his intellectual development. Ostensibly a critique of Emanuel Swedenborg's claims about supernatural visions and communication with spirits, the work actually represented Kant's first systematic attack on traditional metaphysics and its pretensions to knowledge about supersensible reality. He argued that human reason had no legitimate access to the realm beyond possible experience, that all claims about God, the soul, and the afterlife were fundamentally unverifiable and therefore meaningless from a cognitive standpoint. But rather than leading him to skepticism or materialism, this recognition pointed toward a new understanding of the proper domain and function of human reason. Perhaps the mind's inability to know things as they exist independently of experience was not a limitation but a necessary condition for the possibility of objective knowledge within the boundaries of possible experience. Perhaps the very features of mind that prevented it from grasping ultimate metaphysical reality were precisely what enabled it to construct the organized, law-governed world of scientific knowledge. These insights were still fragmentary and undeveloped in the 1760s, but they pointed toward the revolutionary synthesis that Kant would achieve in his mature critical philosophy. He was beginning to see that the apparent failure of traditional metaphysics might actually clear the ground for a new and more modest but also more secure form of philosophical knowledge. By accepting the limits of human reason, philosophy might paradoxically discover new sources of certainty and new foundations for ethics, politics, and religion. The stage was set for the intellectual revolution that would transform not only Kant's own thinking, but the entire subsequent history of Western philosophy. In the quiet study of his modest house in Königsberg, surrounded by his carefully organized books and papers, the methodical professor was preparing to launch an assault on human complacency that would force every subsequent thinker to confront questions about the nature and limits of knowledge that had never been asked with such systematic rigor and revolutionary intent. The transformation began in 1770, when Kant was finally appointed to the chair of Logic and Metaphysics at the University of Königsberg. At 46 years old, he had spent 15 years as a lowly private dozent, earning his living from student fees and struggling to make ends meet. Now, with a secure professorship and a steady income, he could finally devote himself fully to the philosophical problems that had been consuming his thoughts for over a decade. But what his colleagues and students didn't realize was that this quiet, methodical professor was about to embark on an intellectual journey that would shake the foundations of human knowledge itself. His inaugural dissertation for the professorship, on the form and principles of the sensible and the intelligible world, contained the seeds of ideas that would eventually blossom into his revolutionary critical philosophy. In this work, Kant made a crucial distinction between two different ways of knowing: sensible knowledge, which comes through our senses and is limited to appearances, and intelligible knowledge, which would involve direct access to things as they really are in themselves. Most previous philosophers had assumed that genuine knowledge required somehow getting beyond appearances to grasp reality directly. Kant was beginning to suspect that this assumption was not only wrong, but impossible. The insight was both liberating and terrifying. If human beings could never know things as they exist independently of our ways of experiencing them, then centuries of metaphysical speculation about the ultimate nature of reality had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding. But if we could develop a rigorous science of appearances, if we could understand the laws and structures that govern human experience itself, then we might achieve a new kind of certainty that would be immune to skeptical attack. For the next 11 years, from 1770 to 1781, Kant published virtually nothing. His friends and colleagues began to worry that his creative powers were declining, that the promising young philosopher had settled into comfortable academic routine without producing the major works that his early writings had seemed to promise. They could not have been more wrong. During this period of apparent silence, Kant was engaged in the most intensive philosophical work of his entire career, systematically dismantling and rebuilding the entire edifice of human knowledge. The problem that drove this sustained effort was one that Hume had identified, but failed to solve. How can we justify our belief that the future will resemble the past? How do we know that the sun will rise tomorrow, that dropped objects will fall, that fire will burn and ice will freeze? Hume had shown that neither reason nor experience could provide adequate justification for these beliefs. Reason alone could never prove that the future must resemble the past, since there was no logical contradiction in imagining that natural laws might suddenly change. But experience could not help either, since any appeal to past experience would involve the very assumption we were trying to prove. Most philosophers had responded to this challenge by either dismissing it as mere academic skepticism, or by appealing to divine providence or natural instinct to bridge the gap between past experience and future expectation. Kant realized that neither response was adequate. The problem Hume had identified was real and serious, touching the very foundations of scientific knowledge. But perhaps Hume had made a crucial error in his analysis of the problem. Perhaps he had misunderstood what knowledge actually involves and how the human mind relates to the objects of its experience. The breakthrough came when Kant realized that both rationalists and empiricists had been making the same fundamental assumption about the nature of knowledge. Both traditions assumed that genuine knowledge required the mind to conform to its objects, to somehow mirror or copy the structure of an independently existing reality. Rationalists thought this conformity could be achieved through pure reason, while empiricists believed it required careful attention to sensory experience. But what if both approaches had the relationship exactly backwards? What if objects must conform to our knowledge rather than knowledge conforming to objects? What if the mind was not a passive receiver of information from the external world, but an active constructor of the very experience it sought to understand? This would mean that the fundamental structures of human experience, the basic categories and principles that organize our perception of space, time, and causation, were not features of things as they exist independently of us, but rather necessary conditions for the possibility of any coherent experience at all. This insight, which Kant compared to the Copernican revolution in astronomy, promised to resolve the deadlock between rationalism and empiricism, while also answering Hume's skeptical challenge. We could have genuine a priori knowledge about the structure of experience because that structure was partly contributed by the mind itself. The principle of causation, for example, was not something we discovered through observation of the external world, but rather a necessary condition for having any organized experience of temporal succession. We could be certain that every event would have a cause because causation was built into the very framework through which we experience events. But this solution came with a price that many philosophers found too high to pay. If the fundamental structures of experience were contributed by the mind rather than discovered in the world, then we could never know things as they exist in themselves, independently of our ways of experiencing them. The distinction between appearances and things in themselves was not just a useful analytical tool, but an absolute and unbridgeable metaphysical divide. Human knowledge was limited to the realm of appearances, to phenomena as they show up within the structures of human sensibility and understanding. This limitation was not a defect or failure of human cognition, but rather the necessary price of having any objective knowledge at all. By accepting the boundaries of possible experience, we could achieve genuine certainty within those boundaries. By giving up the impossible dream of knowing things as they exist independently of any possible experience, we could establish secure foundations for mathematics, natural science, and even morality. Kant spent years working out the implications of this revolutionary approach, developing what he called Transcendental philosophy. This was not philosophy about transcendent objects beyond the reach of human experience, but rather philosophy that investigated the transcendental conditions that make experience possible in the first place. What are the necessary structures of space and time that allow us to have sensory intuitions? What are the fundamental categories of understanding that allow us to organize those intuitions into coherent judgments? What are the regulative ideas of reason that guide our systematic investigation of nature? The work was extraordinarily difficult and complex, requiring Kant to invent an entirely new philosophical vocabulary to express ideas that had never been clearly formulated before. He had to distinguish between different kinds of a priori knowledge, different faculties of the mind, different types of synthesis that occur in human cognition. He had to show exactly how synthetic a priori judgments were possible, how the mind could have genuine knowledge about the structure of experience without that knowledge being merely analytic or tautological. The project was made even more challenging by Kant's determination to preserve space for human freedom and moral responsibility within his new philosophical framework. If the natural world was completely determined by causal laws, and if human beings were part of the natural world, then it seemed that everything we do must be the inevitable result of prior causes stretching back to the beginning of time. How could there be room for genuine moral choice and responsibility in such a deterministic universe? Kant's solution was to argue that the same distinction between appearances and things in themselves that limited our theoretical knowledge also opened up space for practical freedom. As appearances, human actions were indeed subject to the universal law of causation and could be studied scientifically like any other natural phenomena. But as things in themselves, human beings might possess a kind of freedom that transcended the causal order entirely, a freedom that belonged not to the phenomenal world of space and time, but to an intelligible realm beyond the reach of theoretical knowledge. This solution required Kant to develop a completely new understanding of moral obligation and practical reason. If moral laws could not be derived from theoretical knowledge about human nature or the consequences of actions, then they must have their source in reason itself, in the autonomous capacity of rational beings to legislate universal laws for themselves. The famous categorical imperative, with its demand to act only according to maxims that could become universal laws, was not an arbitrary command imposed from outside, but rather the expression of reason's own legislative authority in the practical sphere. The synthesis of all these ideas finally appeared in 1781 with the publication of the Critique of Pure Reason, a work of such unprecedented scope and complexity that it immediately established Kant as one of the most important philosophers who had ever lived. The book was nearly 800 pages long, written in a dense and technical style that made extraordinary demands on its readers. Kant himself admitted that the work was dry and difficult, lacking the literary graces that might have made it more accessible to general readers. But those who persevered through its labyrinthine arguments discovered a philosophical vision of breathtaking originality and power. Here was a systematic account of human knowledge that seemed to resolve centuries of philosophical dispute while opening up entirely new territories for investigation. Here was a defense of the possibility of synthetic a priori knowledge that rescued both mathematics and natural science from human skepticism, while also establishing clear limits for the legitimate exercise of theoretical reason. The initial reception was mixed and often confused. Many readers simply could not understand what Kant was trying to accomplish, or why his approach represented such a radical departure from previous philosophy. Some dismissed the work as unnecessarily obscure, a deliberate attempt to mystify simple truths through Baroque theoretical machinery. Others recognized its importance, but misunderstood its central arguments, interpreting Kant as either a more radical skeptic than Hume, or as a traditional metaphysician who had simply invented new terminology for old ideas. Kant was deeply frustrated by these misunderstandings, but he was also energized by the recognition that he had indeed accomplished something unprecedented in the history of philosophy. Over the next several years, he worked feverishly to clarify and extend his revolutionary insights, producing a series of works that would establish the critical philosophy as one of the defining intellectual achievements of the Enlightenment. In 1783, he published the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics, a shorter and more accessible introduction to the main themes of the first critique. This work attempted to guide readers through the essential arguments without the full technical apparatus that had made the original so difficult to penetrate. Kant also responded directly to some of the criticisms and misunderstandings that had greeted the first critique, clarifying his position on key issues and defending his approach against alternative interpretations. But even as he was working to clarify his theoretical philosophy, Kant was developing the practical dimension of his critical system. The limitation of theoretical knowledge to the realm of appearances had been motivated partly by the need to preserve space for moral freedom and responsibility. Now he had to show exactly how practical reason operated within that space, how moral laws were possible, and how they related to the theoretical structures he had already established. The result was the Critique of Practical Reason, published in 1788. This work argued that practical reason had its own distinctive principles and procedures that were independent of theoretical knowledge, but equally valid and necessary. The moral law was not derived from empirical observation of human behaviour or theoretical analysis of human nature, but rather from reason's own legislative activity in the practical sphere. When we act morally, we are not following rules imposed from outside, but rather expressing our own rational autonomy, our capacity to rise above the merely natural determination of desire and inclination. This understanding of moral autonomy had profound implications for every aspect of human life. Politics could no longer be understood as merely the art of managing competing interests or maintaining social order, but had to be grounded in principles that respected the rational dignity of every human being. Religion could no longer rely on theoretical proofs of God's existence or appeals to external authority, but had to be understood as a practical postulate necessary for the complete realization of moral community. Education could no longer aim simply at transmitting useful information or marketable skills, but had to cultivate the capacity for autonomous moral judgment that defined human beings as rational agents. The third and final critique, the Critique of Judgment, appeared in 1790 and attempted to bridge the gap between the theoretical and practical domains that the first two critiques had established. How could there be any connection between the mechanistic natural world described by theoretical reason and the realm of moral freedom explored by practical reason? How could human beings understand themselves as both natural objects, subject to causal laws, and moral agents capable of transcending natural determination? Kant's answer involved an analysis of aesthetic and teleological judgment, the kinds of judgments we make when we find something beautiful or when we interpret natural phenomena as if they were designed for particular purposes. These judgments revealed a capacity of mind that was neither purely theoretical nor purely practical, but rather a kind of reflective judgment that allowed us to experience the world as if it were designed to accommodate our cognitive and moral needs. The three critiques together constituted a philosophical system of unprecedented comprehensiveness and rigour. Kant had not only resolved the traditional disputes between rationalists and empiricists, but had also established new foundations for mathematics, natural science, morality, politics, religion, and aesthetics. He had shown how human reason could be both limited and powerful, how it could achieve genuine knowledge within appropriate boundaries while avoiding the dogmatic excesses that had characterized so much previous philosophy. But the impact of Kant's work extended far beyond academic philosophy. His ideas about human dignity and autonomy provided intellectual ammunition for political reformers across Europe who were challenging traditional forms of authority and social hierarchy. His analysis of the conditions for genuine knowledge influenced the development of new approaches to scientific methodology and educational theory. His understanding of aesthetic judgment shaped new movements in art and literature that emphasized the creative freedom of the individual imagination. Yet even as his influence spread across intellectual and cultural life, Kant himself remained anchored in the quiet routines of provincial academic existence. He continued to live in the same modest house, to follow the same rigid daily schedule, to teach the same courses year after year. The man who had revolutionized human understanding of knowledge, freedom, and judgment appeared to most observers as nothing more than an eccentric bachelor professor whose most notable characteristic was his obsessive punctuality. This apparent contradiction between the revolutionary character of his ideas and the conventional pattern of his daily life was not accidental, but rather reflected deep features of his philosophical temperament. Kant believed that genuine freedom was expressed not through dramatic gestures or romantic rebellion, but through the steady cultivation of rational autonomy in every aspect of ordinary existence. The moral law was not something that required heroic sacrifice or extraordinary circumstances to manifest itself, but rather something that could and should guide every mundane decision and routine action. As the 1790s unfolded and Kant entered his 70s, he began to grapple with questions about the ultimate direction and purpose of human history. If individual human beings could achieve moral autonomy through the proper use of practical reason, what about the species as a whole? Was there any pattern or direction to historical development that might suggest humanity was making genuine progress toward greater freedom and enlightenment? These questions would occupy him increasingly as he moved into the final phase of his extraordinary intellectual career, a phase that would see him grappling with some of the most fundamental questions about human destiny and the ultimate meaning of rational existence itself. Kant's growing interest in the philosophy of history was not merely an academic exercise, but reflected his deep conviction that individual moral progress was meaningless unless it could somehow be connected to the broader development of the human species. In his 1784 essay, Idea for a Universal History with a Cosmopolitan Purpose, he proposed what seemed like an almost impossible question. Could the chaotic, violent, and often senseless course of human events actually be guided by some hidden rational plan that was gradually leading humanity toward greater freedom and enlightenment? The question was audacious because it required Kant to find a middle path between two equally unsatisfactory extremes. On one side stood those who believed that history was simply a random sequence of events, driven by accident, passion, and the clash of competing interests with no overarching meaning or direction. On the other side were those who claimed to discern divine providence working through historical events, guiding everything toward predetermined ends that human beings could neither fully understand nor meaningfully influence. Kant's solution was characteristically ingenious and complex. He argued that we could think of history as if it were guided by a rational plan without claiming to know that such a plan actually exists. This was not a theoretical truth that could be proven through logical argument or empirical observation, but rather what he called a regulative idea, a necessary assumption for practical action that helped organize our understanding of historical development without making illegitimate claims about ultimate metaphysical reality. The key insight was that human beings are naturally social creatures who nevertheless possess what Kant memorably called their unsocial sociability. We need other people to develop our capacities and achieve our goals, but we also compete with them, conflict with them, and often treat them as obstacles to our own advancement. This fundamental tension creates what Kant described as the mechanism through which nature accomplishes her secret plan for human development. Competition forces individuals to develop their talents and abilities beyond what they would achieve in isolation. Conflict between groups leads to the development of more sophisticated forms of political organization and international law. The very selfishness and antagonism that make human social life so difficult also drive the innovations and improvements that gradually advance civilization toward greater sophistication and moral enlightenment. But this progress was neither automatic nor guaranteed. Each generation had to choose whether to build upon the achievements of previous generations or to squander them through war, oppression, and moral regression. The ultimate goal toward which history might be progressing was what Kant called a universal cosmopolitan constitution, a global legal order that would secure peace between nations while protecting the freedom and dignity of individuals within each society. This vision of cosmopolitan progress became increasingly important to Kant as he witnessed the tumultuous events of the 1790s. The French Revolution had begun in 1789 with declarations of universal human rights and rational principles of political organization that seemed to vindicate his philosophical analysis of human freedom and dignity. But the revolution had quickly descended into violence, terror, and eventually military dictatorship under Napoleon, raising troubling questions about whether humanity was actually capable of the moral progress that critical philosophy had seemed to make possible. Kant's response to these events revealed both his unwavering commitment to rational principles and his realistic understanding of the obstacles that stood in the way of their implementation. In his 1795 essay, Toward Perpetual Peace, he outlined a detailed proposal for international legal institutions that could gradually reduce the likelihood of war while preserving the sovereignty of individual nations. The proposal was both idealistic in its ultimate vision and practical in its recognition that such institutions would have to be developed gradually through the accumulated experience of international cooperation rather than through sudden revolutionary transformation. The essay began with what appeared to be a purely theoretical analysis of the conditions necessary for lasting peace between nations, but it quickly became clear that Kant was addressing some of the most pressing political questions of his time. How could European nations find alternatives to the endless cycle of war and conquest that had dominated international relations for centuries? How could the revolutionary ideals of freedom and equality be implemented without producing the chaos and violence that had characterized recent French experience? Kant's answers drew directly on the insights he had developed in his analysis of individual moral autonomy. Just as individual human beings achieved genuine freedom through submission to self-imposed rational law rather than through the arbitrary pursuit of desire and inclination, so nations could achieve genuine security and prosperity through voluntary participation in international legal institutions rather than through the military domination of their neighbours. The parallel was not merely metaphorical, but reflected Kant's conviction that the same rational principles that governed individual moral life also provided the foundation for just political institutions at both domestic and international levels. A truly republican constitution, one that separated powers and required the consent of citizens for major policy decisions, would be much less likely to engage in aggressive war than traditional monarchical or aristocratic governments that could commit national resources to military adventures without consulting those who would bear the costs. But the path towards such rational political institutions was long and difficult, requiring not only constitutional reform, but also fundamental changes in how people understood their relationships to political authority and to other nations. Citizens would have to develop what Kant called a cosmopolitan perspective, an ability to see themselves as members of a universal human community rather than simply as subjects of particular sovereign states. This educational and cultural transformation could not be accomplished through government decree or revolutionary violence, but would require the gradual development of what we might now call civil society. Independent institutions like universities, churches, scientific societies, and literary publications would have to create spaces for rational public discussion that could slowly influence popular opinion and political practice. Kant's own contributions to this process of public enlightenment became increasingly important during his final decades. His shorter essays on political and historical topics reached much larger audiences than his technical philosophical works and helped spread critical philosophy's insights about human dignity and rational autonomy to educated readers across Europe and beyond. He became something like the public intellectual of the German Enlightenment, someone whose opinions on contemporary questions carried weight because of his systematic philosophical achievements, but who could also address practical concerns in accessible language. The role was not always comfortable for someone of Kant's naturally cautious and scholarly temperament. In 1794, he received an official warning from the Prussian government about his writings on religion, which authorities considered potentially subversive of public order and traditional Christian faith. The warning came from Friedrich Wilhelm II, who had succeeded Frederick the Great as King of Prussia and was much less tolerant of intellectual independence than his predecessor had been. Kant's response revealed both his commitment to intellectual honesty and his practical wisdom about the limits of direct confrontation with political authority. He promised to refrain from public writings about religion during the current king's reign, but he carefully worded his promise to apply only to that particular monarch's, rather than to any future government. When Friedrich Wilhelm II died in 1797, Kant considered himself free to return to religious topics, which he did in his final major work, The Conflict of the Faculties, published in 1798. The incident illustrated the complex relationship between philosophical inquiry and political power that would remain a central concern for intellectuals throughout the modern period. How could scholars maintain their independence and integrity while avoiding the persecution that might result from challenging established authorities too directly? How could new ideas gain influence in society without provoking backlash that might destroy the very institutions that made intellectual progress possible? Kant's strategy was to work within existing institutions while gradually expanding the scope of rational discussion and criticism. He remained a loyal subject of the Prussian state, while arguing for principles that would ultimately require fundamental changes in how political authority was understood and exercised. He maintained his position within the established church while developing a rational theology that reduced traditional Christian doctrine to moral essentials that could be defended through practical reason alone. This approach reflected his broader conviction that genuine progress required patience, persistence, and respect for the complexity of human institutions. Revolutionary enthusiasm might produce dramatic short-term changes, but lasting improvement required the slow cultivation of rational habits and attitudes that could sustain better institutions over time. The French Revolution had shown both the possibilities and the dangers of attempting to implement rational principles too quickly and without adequate attention to existing social and cultural conditions. As Kant entered his 70s, his daily routines became even more rigid and predictable, but his intellectual energy remained remarkably strong. He continued to teach regular courses at the university, to receive visitors from across Europe who sought his opinions on philosophical and political questions, and to work on new projects that extended his critical philosophy into previously unexplored territories. One of his most ambitious late works was The Metaphysics of Morals, published in 1797 when he was 73 years old. This massive treatise attempted to show how the abstract principles of practical reason that he had established in the Second Critique could be applied to the concrete questions of legal and political philosophy that governments and courts had to address in their daily operations. The work was divided into two main parts. The doctrine of right analysed the principles that should govern external relationships between persons, including property rights, contract law, criminal justice, and international relations. The doctrine of virtue examined the internal moral obligations that individuals have toward themselves and others, including duties of self-improvement, beneficence, and respect for human dignity. The distinction between right and virtue was crucial for Kant's understanding of the proper relationship between law and morality. Legal institutions could legitimately enforce external compliance with certain minimal standards of behaviour, but they could not and should not attempt to make people virtuous in the full moral sense. Genuine virtue required autonomous choice and could not be produced through external coercion, no matter how well-intentioned. This insight had profound implications for questions about religious freedom, freedom of expression, and the limits of government authority that were becoming increasingly urgent as traditional forms of political legitimacy came under challenge across Europe. Kant argued that governments had an obligation to protect the external freedom that made moral autonomy possible, but they exceeded their legitimate authority when they attempted to dictate the content of individual moral or religious beliefs. The analysis was particularly relevant to contemporary debates about the relationship between church and state. Kant argued that established churches that relied on government support to maintain their authority were actually undermining the very religious faith they claimed to promote. Genuine religious belief required free rational inquiry and voluntary commitment that could not be produced through legal privilege or social pressure. But Kant's critique of established religion did not lead him to embrace the materialistic atheism that some Enlightenment thinkers had adopted. Instead, he developed what he called moral theology, an approach that grounded religious belief in practical rather than theoretical reason. We could not prove God's existence through logical argument or empirical observation, but we had to assume God's existence as a necessary condition for the ultimate coherence of moral life. This assumption was what Kant called a postulate of practical reason, something that we had to believe in order to make sense of our moral obligations and hopes, even though we could not demonstrate its truth through theoretical knowledge. Along with the immortality of the soul and the freedom of the will, belief in God was necessary for what Kant called the highest good, the complete harmony between virtue and happiness that represented the ultimate goal of moral striving. The postulates of practical reason allowed Kant to maintain both his commitment to rigorous intellectual honesty and his conviction that human life had ultimate meaning and purpose. We could not know with theoretical certainty that moral effort would be rewarded or that justice would ultimately prevail, but we had to act as if these things were true in order to maintain our commitment to moral obligation in the face of apparent evidence to the contrary. This delicate balance between critical skepticism and practical faith became increasingly important to Kant as he confronted his own mortality and reflected on the ultimate significance of his philosophical work. He had devoted his entire adult life to the systematic investigation of human reason and its proper limits. But what lasting difference would his efforts make if individuals and societies continued to be driven by passion, prejudice, and self-interest, rather than by rational principle? The question became more pressing as his physical and mental powers began to show signs of decline. By the late 1790s, colleagues and visitors noticed that his memory was becoming less reliable, and his ability to sustain complex arguments was diminishing. The man who had revolutionized philosophy through the sheer force of systematic thinking was gradually losing the intellectual capacities that had made his achievements possible. Yet even as his faculties weakened, Kant continued to work on projects that reflected his enduring optimism about human potential for moral progress. His final published work, The Conflict of the Faculties, examined the proper relationship between philosophy and the traditional learned professions of theology, law, and medicine. The work argued that philosophy had a unique responsibility to subject all claims to knowledge to rigorous critical examination, even when such examination challenged the authority of established institutions and traditional beliefs. The argument was both a defense of academic freedom and a final statement of Kant's conviction that rational inquiry was essential for human flourishing. Without the constant questioning and criticism that philosophy provided, societies would inevitably stagnate in comfortable prejudices that prevented them from recognizing new truths or adapting to changing circumstances. But philosophy alone was not sufficient for human progress. The insights of critical inquiry had to be translated into practical reforms that could gradually improve the conditions of human life. This required not only the work of professional philosophers, but also the efforts of educators, political leaders, and ordinary citizens who could apply rational principles to the concrete challenges they faced in their daily lives. As the 18th century drew to a close and a new century began, Kant could look back on an extraordinary intellectual career that had fundamentally altered how human beings understood themselves and their place in the cosmos. The quiet professor, who had never travelled more than 60 miles from his birthplace, had constructed a philosophical system whose influence would spread across continents and centuries, shaping everything from political revolutions to scientific methodology to artistic movements. But perhaps more important than any specific doctrine or argument was the example Kant had provided of what it meant to live according to rational principles in an uncertain and often hostile world. His unwavering commitment to intellectual honesty, his respect for human dignity, and his patient faith in the possibility of moral progress had demonstrated that philosophy was not merely an academic exercise, but a way of life that could provide meaning and direction even in the face of the deepest uncertainties about human destiny and cosmic purpose. The final phase of Kant's life unfolded against the backdrop of a rapidly changing world that seemed to validate both his hopes and his fears about human progress. Napoleon's armies were reshaping the map of Europe, carrying revolutionary ideals across national boundaries, while also demonstrating the ease with which rational political principles could be corrupted by personal ambition and military power. The Holy Roman Empire, that ancient symbol of traditional authority, was crumbling under the pressure of French expansion and German nationalism. Everywhere Kant looked, the old certainties were giving way to forces that defied easy categorization as either progressive or reactionary. Within his own small corner of this transforming world, Kant struggled to maintain the intellectual routines that had sustained him for decades. His daily walks became shorter and less regular as his physical strength declined. The precise schedule that had once regulated every aspect of his existence began to break down under the pressure of failing memory and diminishing energy. Visitors who had known him at the height of his powers were shocked by the changes they observed in the man who had once seemed like an intellectual force of nature. Yet even as his body weakened, Kant's mind remained focused on the questions that had driven his entire philosophical career. In conversations with friends and students, he continued to refine his understanding of the relationship between theoretical knowledge and practical wisdom. He worried about whether his complex philosophical system could be simplified enough to influence the broader public discourse that was shaping political and social developments across Europe. The technical vocabulary and intricate arguments that had been necessary to establish critical philosophy on secure foundations might also prevent it from having the practical impact that Kant had always hoped it would achieve. This tension between philosophical rigor and popular accessibility had plagued Kant throughout his career, but it became particularly acute as he witnessed the violent excesses of revolutionary politics in France and the authoritarian reaction that followed. The very people who most needed the guidance that critical philosophy could provide were often least equipped to understand its subtle distinctions and qualified conclusions. How could the insights about human dignity and rational autonomy that lay at the heart of his moral philosophy be translated into forms that could guide practical decision-making in the messy world of actual politics? Kant's response was to focus increasingly on educational questions that had always been implicit in his philosophical work but had never received systematic treatment. If critical philosophy was to have lasting influence, it would have to shape how future generations learn to think about themselves and their relationships to others. This meant developing new approaches to moral education that could cultivate the capacity for autonomous judgment without falling into either dogmatic indoctrination or relativistic permissiveness. The challenge was enormous because it required fundamental changes in how educators understood their role and responsibilities. Traditional approaches to moral instruction had relied heavily on authority, whether religious, political, or cultural, to provide students with ready-made answers to ethical questions. But Kant's analysis suggested that genuine moral development required individuals to discover and internalize rational principles through their own thinking rather than through passive acceptance of external commands. This did not mean that teachers should simply abandon their students to figure out everything for themselves through trial and error. Rather, it meant that education should focus on developing the intellectual and emotional capacities that made autonomous moral judgment possible. Students needed to learn how to think systematically about complex problems, how to consider the perspectives and interests of others, and how to distinguish between principles that could be universally applied and those that reflected merely personal preferences or cultural accidents. The educational implications of critical philosophy extended far beyond formal schooling to encompass the entire range of institutions and practices that shaped public opinion and cultural development. Churches, newspapers, voluntary associations, and informal social networks all played crucial roles in either promoting or hindering the kind of rational discourse that Kant believed was essential for moral progress. During his final years, Kant paid particular attention to the role that religious institutions could play in fostering moral development without undermining intellectual freedom. His own relationship with Christianity had always been complex, shaped by his pietist upbringing, but also by his philosophical commitment to rational autonomy. He had concluded that the essential core of Christian teaching was consistent with the moral insights of critical philosophy. But he also believed that much traditional Christian doctrine was either irrelevant to moral life or actively harmful to the development of rational faith. The challenge was to preserve what was valuable in religious tradition while eliminating those elements that encouraged superstition, fanaticism, or passive dependence on external authority. Kant argued that true religion was fundamentally moral religion, focused on helping individuals understand and fulfill their duties to themselves and others, rather than on elaborate theological speculation or ritualistic observance. This approach to religious questions reflected his broader conviction that all human institutions should be evaluated according to whether they promoted or hindered the development of rational autonomy. Political systems, legal codes, economic arrangements, and social customs all had to be tested against the standard of whether they treated human beings as ends in themselves, rather than as mere means to other purposes. The application of this principle led Kant to positions that were often ahead of his time, but would later become central to liberal democratic theory. He argued for representative government, separation of powers, freedom of speech and religion, and international institutions that could reduce the likelihood of war between nations. He also defended the rights of women to participate in public discourse, though he stopped short of advocating full political equality, and he condemned slavery as fundamentally incompatible with human dignity, though he shared many of the racial prejudices common among educated Europeans of his era. These limitations in Kant's thinking reflected the inevitable constraints that historical circumstances place on even the most penetrating intellectual analysis, but they also demonstrated his larger point about the gradual and incomplete nature of human progress toward greater enlightenment. Each generation had to build upon the achievements of previous generations while also correcting their errors and extending their insights into previously unexplored territories. As Kant entered his final years, he became increasingly preoccupied with questions about the ultimate destiny of the human species. Would the slow progress toward greater freedom and rationality that he had traced in his philosophy of history continue indefinitely, Or were there natural limits to human development that would eventually bring moral progress to a halt? Could the tensions between individual autonomy and social cooperation that drove historical development be permanently resolved? Or would they continue to generate new conflicts and challenges for future generations? These questions had no definitive answers within the framework of critical philosophy, since they concerned matters that lay beyond the boundaries of possible human knowledge. But Kant believed that we had to think about them anyway, not because we could know the answers with certainty, but because our practical choices in the present were inevitably shaped by our assumptions about the future direction of human development. The regulative ideas that guided historical thinking were similar to the postulates of practical reason that supported individual moral life. We had to act as if human progress were possible and worthwhile, even though we could not prove that it would actually occur. We had to work for the improvement of political institutions and social conditions, even though we could not guarantee that our efforts would succeed. We had to educate young people for citizenship in a more rational and just world, even though we could not know whether such a world would ever come into existence. This combination of practical optimism and theoretical humility became increasingly important to Kant as he confronted the reality of his own approaching death. He had devoted his entire adult life to the systematic investigation of human reason and its proper limits, but he could not know with certainty whether his philosophical work would have any lasting impact on the broader development of human civilization. The uncertainty was particularly painful because Kant's philosophy had always been motivated by practical concerns about how human beings should live, rather than by purely academic curiosity about abstract theoretical problems. He had constructed his elaborate system of critical philosophy not as an end in itself, but as a means to the larger goal of promoting human freedom, dignity, and happiness. If that system proved too complex or demanding for widespread adoption, then its theoretical sophistication would count for very little in the final analysis. Yet Kant also recognized that intellectual work, like moral action, had to be undertaken for its own sake rather than for the sake of guaranteed results. The duty to think clearly and honestly about fundamental questions was not conditional on the certainty that such thinking would produce immediate practical benefits. Just as individuals had to act according to moral principles, regardless of whether doing so would make them happy or successful, so philosophers had to pursue truth, regardless of whether their discoveries would be welcomed or implemented by their contemporaries. This understanding of intellectual duty as an end in itself provided Kant with a source of consolation and meaning that sustained him through the physical decline and social isolation of his final years. Even if his particular contributions to philosophy were eventually forgotten or superseded, the example he had provided of rigorous and honest thinking would continue to inspire others who faced similar challenges in their own historical circumstances. The gradual deterioration of Kant's mental faculties became increasingly apparent to those around him during the early years of the new century. His memory, once so precise and reliable, began to fail him in disturbing ways. He would sometimes forget the names of close friends or lose track of conversations in mid-sentence. His legendary punctuality gave way to confusion about time and scheduling that left him disoriented and frustrated. Perhaps most troubling of all, the systematic clarity of thought that had been his greatest intellectual asset began to break down under the pressure of advancing age. The man who had once been able to construct arguments of extraordinary complexity and rigor found himself struggling to follow simple logical connections or to maintain consistent positions on familiar topics. These changes were particularly difficult for someone whose entire sense of identity had been built around intellectual achievement and rational self-control. Kant had always prided himself on his ability to subject every aspect of experience to critical analysis, to find rational principles that could guide practical decision-making even in the most challenging circumstances. Now he was forced to confront the limits of human reason in the most personal and immediate way possible, through the gradual dissolution of his own rational capacities. Yet even this final challenge provided opportunities for philosophical reflection that were consistent with the insights of critical philosophy. The decline of his intellectual powers confirmed his long-standing conviction that human beings were finite creatures whose knowledge and understanding were necessarily limited by the conditions of their existence. The rational autonomy that he had celebrated as the foundation of human dignity was itself dependent on biological and psychological conditions that could be altered by disease, injury, or natural aging. This recognition did not undermine the validity of critical philosophy, but rather reinforced its central message about the importance of understanding and accepting the boundaries within which human reason must operate. The categorical imperative remained valid as a guide to moral action, even when particular individuals could no longer fully comprehend its rational foundation. The regulative ideas that organize scientific inquiry retain their usefulness, even when individual scientists lost the ability to employ them effectively. In his lucid moments during these final years, Kant continued to receive visitors who sought his thoughts on contemporary developments in philosophy, politics, and culture. Many of these conversations revealed a mind that remained remarkably acute when focused on familiar topics, even though its overall functioning had become less reliable. Kant could still explain the basic principles of critical philosophy with considerable clarity, and he continued to show keen interest in how his ideas were being received and developed by younger thinkers. One of the most significant developments during this period was the emergence of German idealism, a philosophical movement that sought to extend Kant's insights about the active role of mind in constructing experience into a comprehensive system that would eliminate the distinction between appearances and things in themselves. Thinkers like Johann Gottlieb Fichte, Friedrich Schelling, and the young Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel argued that Kant had been too cautious in limiting human knowledge to the realm of phenomena. That properly understood, there was no reality beyond what could be known through the systematic development of rational thought. Kant's reaction to these developments was complex and sometimes contradictory. On one hand, he was pleased to see his work generating serious discussion and creative development among capable philosophers. The fact that his ideas had inspired such ambitious systematic thinking suggested that critical philosophy had indeed opened up new territories for rational investigation rather than simply closing off avenues of inquiry. On the other hand, Kant was troubled by what he saw as fundamental misunderstandings of his central insights. The distinction between appearances and things in themselves had not been a temporary limitation to be overcome through more sophisticated theorizing, but rather a permanent feature of the human condition that had to be acknowledged and respected. The attempt to eliminate this distinction threatened to return philosophy to the kind of dogmatic speculation that critical philosophy had been designed to overcome. These disagreements with his philosophical successors reflected Kant's enduring commitment to the modest and self-limiting approach that had characterized his work from the beginning. He had never claimed that critical philosophy provided complete or final answers to the fundamental questions of human existence, only that it offered a more rigorous and honest way of thinking about those questions than had been available before. The tension between ambition and humility that ran through all of Kant's work became particularly evident as he reflected on the legacy he would leave behind. He had accomplished something unprecedented in the history of philosophy, but he had also shown that philosophical accomplishment was necessarily incomplete and provisional. Each generation would have to take up the work of rational inquiry anew, building on previous achievements, while also correcting their limitations and extending them in new directions. As 1804 dawned, Kant's condition continued to deteriorate, though he still maintained some of the routines that had structured his life for so many decades. His servants continued to dress him carefully each morning and to serve his meals at regular times. Visitors were still received in his study, surrounded by the books and papers that represented a lifetime of systematic thinking about the deepest questions human beings could ask. The approaching end brought with it a strange mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness because it marked the conclusion of one of the most remarkable intellectual careers in human history, the final chapter in a life devoted to extending the boundaries of human knowledge and understanding. Relief because it promised release from the frustrating limitations that had increasingly constrained his ability to think and communicate with his former clarity and precision. In these final weeks, Kant's thoughts turned increasingly to the question that had motivated his entire philosophical enterprise from the very beginning. What could human beings hope for in a universe that seemed to operate according to mechanical laws that left no room for freedom, purpose, or ultimate meaning? The answer he had developed through decades of systematic analysis remained as compelling as ever. Even as his own capacity to articulate it continued to fade. Human beings could hope for the gradual realization of moral community, a world in which rational principles of justice and respect for human dignity would increasingly shape political institutions and social relationships. They could hope for the continued development of scientific knowledge that would expand their understanding of natural processes and their ability to improve the conditions of human life. They could hope for the eventual establishment of international legal institutions that would reduce the likelihood of war and promote peaceful cooperation between nations. But most fundamentally, they could hope for the continued development of their own rational and moral capacities, their ability to think clearly about complex problems and to act according to principles that could be universally shared. This hope was not based on theoretical knowledge about the ultimate structure of reality, but rather on practical faith in the value and possibility of human moral progress. As February 1804 progressed, Kant's physical condition weakened dramatically. The daily walks that had regulated his life for so many years became impossible. His appetite failed, and he spent increasing amounts of time in bed, drifting in and out of consciousness. Friends and colleagues who visited during these final days were struck by his peaceful acceptance of approaching death, his apparent freedom from the fear and anxiety that might have been expected given his philosophical emphasis on the limits of human knowledge about ultimate questions. On February 12, 1804, as winter maintained its grip on Königsberg and snow covered the familiar streets where he had walked for 8 decades, Immanuel Kant drew his final breath. His last recorded words were, "Es ist gut," it is good. Whether this represented a judgment about his own life, an acceptance of death, or simply a moment of confused utterance, no one could say with certainty. But the words seemed fitting for a philosopher who had devoted his entire career to understanding the conditions under which human beings could legitimately claim that something was truly good. The news of Kant's death spread quickly through Königsberg and then across the German states and beyond. Universities held memorial services. Newspapers published lengthy obituaries attempting to summarize his contributions to human knowledge. Scholars began the process of collecting and editing his unpublished manuscripts, recognizing that even his fragmentary later writings might contain insights that would reward careful study. But perhaps the most significant response to Kant's death was the quiet recognition among thoughtful people throughout Europe that something unprecedented had ended. Here had been a human being who had managed to combine extraordinary intellectual achievement with exemplary moral character, who had shown that the life of the mind could be lived with both rigorous honesty and practical wisdom. His example suggested possibilities for human development that might inspire others to attempt similar combinations of theoretical insight and ethical commitment. The funeral itself was a modest affair, reflecting Kant's own preferences for simplicity and his lifelong distrust of ceremonial display. He was buried in the cathedral cemetery of Königsberg, his grave marked by a simple stone that bore his name and dates without elaborate decoration or lengthy inscription. The location seemed appropriate for someone who had spent his entire life in that small Prussian city, never travelling far from home, but managing to send his ideas across continents and centuries. Yet even as Kant's physical presence disappeared from the world, his intellectual influence was just beginning to reach its full extent. The 3 critiques would be translated into dozens of languages and studied in universities around the globe. His insights about human dignity and rational autonomy would inspire political movements seeking to extend freedom and justice to previously excluded groups. His analysis of the conditions for genuine knowledge would reshape scientific methodology and educational theory. Perhaps most importantly, his example of rigorous and honest thinking about fundamental questions would continue to challenge and inspire anyone who refused to accept easy answers to the deepest problems of human existence. In showing what one finite, mortal human being could accomplish through patient and systematic reasoning, Kant had demonstrated possibilities for intellectual and moral development that would remain relevant as long as human beings continue to ask questions about themselves and their place in the cosmos. The revolution in human self-understanding that had begun in a modest house on the cobblestone streets of 18th century Königsberg would continue to unfold in ways that its author could never have anticipated, but would surely have appreciated. For Kant had always insisted that genuine philosophical insights were not the private property of their discoverers, but rather contributions to the common human enterprise of rational inquiry that transcended the boundaries of individual lives, particular cultures, and historical epochs. Human reason itself was immortal, even though particular rational beings were finite and mortal. The questions that had consumed Kant's attention would continue to demand answers from future generations of thinkers who would build upon his achievements while also correcting his errors and extending his insights into territories he had never explored. In this sense, the death of Immanuel Kant marked not an ending, but a beginning, the start of a new chapter in humanity's ongoing attempt to understand itself and its possibilities through the rigorous and honest use of rational thought. The intellectual earthquake that Kant's death sent through European philosophy was only the beginning of a transformation that would reshape human thought for centuries to come. Within months of his burial in Königsberg, his former students and colleagues began the monumental task of preserving and interpreting the vast corpus of writings he had left behind. But what they discovered in his personal papers and unpublished manuscripts revealed a thinker whose revolutionary insights had extended even beyond what his published works had suggested. Among the most significant discoveries were extensive notes on what Kant had privately called his practical anthropology, a systematic investigation into how the abstract principles of critical philosophy could be applied to the concrete realities of human social and political life. These fragments revealed a philosopher who had been deeply concerned with questions about education, criminal justice, international relations, and economic policy that went far beyond the theoretical frameworks for which he was already famous. The notes on education were particularly revealing, showing Kant's conviction that the ultimate test of any philosophical system was whether it could actually improve the conditions under which human beings lived and developed. He had sketched plans for educational reforms that would cultivate rational autonomy from the earliest ages, teaching children not what to think, but how to think for themselves about the moral and practical challenges they would face as adults. His approach to criminal justice reflected the same commitment to human dignity that had shaped his moral philosophy. Punishment could never be justified simply as a means to deter crime or protect society, but only as a way of respecting the rational agency of criminals themselves. Even those who violated the moral law retained their fundamental humanity and deserved treatment that acknowledged their capacity for moral reform and redemption. The international relations materials contain detailed proposals for the kinds of global institutions that could gradually reduce the likelihood of war while preserving the sovereignty of individual nations. Kant had envisioned a world federation of republican states that would settle disputes through legal procedures rather than military force, but he had also recognized that such institutions would have to develop slowly through the accumulated experience of international cooperation. These unpublished writings demonstrated that Kant's philosophical revolution had implications that extended far beyond academic philosophy into every domain of human experience. His insights about the nature of knowledge, freedom, and moral obligation provided foundations for new approaches to virtually every aspect of social and political life. The task for his intellectual heirs would be to work out these implications systematically while remaining faithful to the critical spirit that had made Kant's achievements possible in the first place. The first generation of post-Kantian philosophers approached this challenge with remarkable ambition and creativity. Johann Gottlieb Fichte, who had initially been inspired by Kant's analysis of practical reason, developed a comprehensive philosophical system that attempted to derive all reality from the self-positing activity of an absolute ego. Friedrich Schelling extended this approach into a philosophy of nature that sought to show how mind and world were ultimately identical manifestations of a single underlying principle. Most ambitious of all was Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, whose systematic dialectical philosophy claimed to overcome the limitations that Kant had identified in human knowledge, by showing how absolute spirit gradually came to know itself through the historical development of human consciousness. For Hegel, the distinction between appearances and things in themselves was not a permanent feature of the human condition, but rather a temporary stage in the development of absolute knowledge that could eventually be transcended. These developments represented creative extensions of Kantian insights, but they also involved fundamental departures from the critical spirit that had motivated Kant's work from the beginning. Where Kant had emphasized the limits of human reason and the importance of intellectual humility, his idealist successors seemed to claim unlimited knowledge of ultimate reality. Where Kant had insisted on the gap between what we can know and what actually exists, they argued for the complete identity of thought and being. The tension between these approaches became one of the defining features of 19th century German philosophy, with different thinkers choosing different strategies for resolving the problems that Kant had identified. Some, like Arthur Schopenhauer, remained closer to Kant's original insights, while developing them in more pessimistic directions. Others, like the early Karl Marx, appropriated Hegelian dialectical methods while rejecting idealist metaphysics in favour of materialist social analysis. But Kant's influence extended far beyond the technical debates of professional philosophers into the broader cultural and political developments that were reshaping European society. The French Revolution had demonstrated both the liberating potential and the dangerous excesses of attempts to reorganize society according to rational principles. The Napoleonic Wars had shown how revolutionary ideals could be corrupted by personal ambition and military power. The gradual industrialization of European economies was creating new forms of social organization that required fresh thinking about justice, freedom, and human dignity. In all these areas, Kant's insights about the nature of human autonomy and the conditions for legitimate political authority provided crucial resources for understanding and responding to rapid social change. liberal political theorists drew on his arguments about the importance of individual rights and representative government. Educational reformers used his analysis of moral development to design new approaches to childhood education. Religious thinkers found in his moral theology a way to maintain faith commitments while accepting the conclusions of modern science and historical criticism. The influence was not limited to Europe but spread wherever European ideas and institutions were transplanted or imposed. The American founding fathers had already incorporated many Enlightenment insights about natural rights and separation of powers into their constitutional framework, but Kant's more systematic analysis of these principles provided additional theoretical support for democratic institutions and individual liberty. The abolition movements that were gaining strength on both sides of the Atlantic found in Kant's emphasis on human dignity powerful arguments against slavery and other forms of systematic oppression. If all rational beings possessed inherent worth that could never be reduced to mere means for other purposes, then the institution of slavery was not just economically inefficient or politically dangerous, but fundamentally immoral in ways that no consequentialist calculation could justify. Women's rights advocates discovered similar resources in Kant's moral philosophy, though they had to extend his insights beyond the limitations that his own historical circumstances had imposed on his thinking. If rational autonomy was the foundation of human dignity, then the exclusion of women from political participation and economic opportunity could not be justified by appeals to natural differences or traditional customs that contradicted this fundamental principle. The scientific revolution that Kant had helped to clarify and justify continued to transform human understanding of the natural world throughout the 19th century. Darwin's theory of evolution provided new insights into the biological origins of human beings that seemed to challenge traditional religious accounts of human nature and destiny. But Kant's distinction between scientific knowledge of appearances and practical faith in moral and religious truths offered ways of accommodating scientific discoveries without abandoning fundamental commitments to human dignity and moral obligation. The development of new mathematical and logical techniques raised fresh questions about the nature of a priori knowledge that Kant had claimed was necessary for the possibility of objective experience. Non-Euclidean geometries suggested that the spatial intuitions Kant had considered universal features of human sensibility might actually be contingent products of particular evolutionary or cultural developments. But these discoveries also confirmed his broader insight that the mind played an active role in constructing the experience it sought to understand. Throughout all these developments, Kant's example of rigorous and systematic thinking about fundamental questions continued to inspire intellectuals who were grappling with unprecedented challenges and opportunities. His demonstration that it was possible to combine intellectual honesty with practical wisdom, scientific understanding with moral commitment, provided a model for engaged scholarship that remained relevant even as the specific content of human knowledge continued to expand and change. The universities that proliferated across Europe and North America during the 19th century institutionalized many of the educational ideals that Kant had pioneered. The research university, with its emphasis on independent inquiry and critical examination of received wisdom, reflected his conviction that genuine learning required active participation rather than passive absorption of authoritative doctrines. The academic freedom that became a defining feature of modern higher education embodied his insights about the importance of protecting rational inquiry from political and religious interference. But perhaps the most significant legacy of Kant's work was not any particular doctrine or institution, but rather the intellectual habits and attitudes that his example had helped to establish. The commitment to following arguments wherever they might lead regardless of their implications for comfortable beliefs or established interests. The recognition that human knowledge was both powerful and limited, capable of genuine insight within appropriate boundaries but prone to dangerous overreach when those boundaries were ignored. The conviction that rational inquiry was not merely an academic exercise, but a practical necessity for anyone who sought to live a fully human life. These habits of mind proved especially important as the 20th century brought challenges that tested the foundations of European civilization in ways that previous generations could hardly have imagined. 2 world wars, totalitarian ideologies, genocidal violence, and the development of weapons capable of destroying all human life forced thoughtful people to reconsider basic assumptions about progress, rationality, and moral development that had shaped Enlightenment optimism about human potential. Some responded to these challenges by rejecting the entire project of rational inquiry and moral philosophy as naive or dangerous illusions that had contributed to the disasters they were meant to prevent. Others sought refuge in religious fundamentalism or political authoritarianism that promised certainty and security at the cost of intellectual freedom and individual autonomy. But many found in Kant's example of critical philosophy resources for understanding and responding to unprecedented challenges without abandoning fundamental commitments to human dignity and rational discourse. The recognition that human reason was finite and fallible, rather than undermining the project of rational inquiry, actually provided important safeguards against the kind of dogmatic overconfidence that had contributed to ideological extremism. The insistence that moral principles had to be capable of universal application offered protection against the relativism and nihilism that seemed to follow from the collapse of traditional sources of authority. The conviction that individual autonomy was the foundation of human dignity provided principled grounds for resisting totalitarian movements that sought to subordinate persons to abstract collective goals. As the 21st century dawned with its own unprecedented challenges and opportunities, Kant's insights about the nature of human knowledge, freedom, and moral obligation remained as relevant as ever. Advances in neuroscience and cognitive psychology were providing new understanding of how the mind actually works, that sometimes confirmed and sometimes challenged his analysis of mental faculties and their operations. Global economic integration and environmental crisis were creating needs for international cooperation that recalled his vision of cosmopolitan legal institutions, while also revealing new obstacles to their realization. The development of artificial intelligence and other technologies that seemed to replicate or exceed human cognitive abilities raised fresh questions about the nature of rational agency and moral responsibility that required the kind of systematic analysis that Kant had pioneered. If machines could perform many of the functions that had previously been considered uniquely human, what remained distinctive about human dignity and autonomy? How should we understand the relationship between intelligence and consciousness, between computational ability and genuine understanding? These questions had no easy answers, but Kant's approach to philosophical problems provided valuable guidance for thinking about them systematically and honestly. The recognition that human beings were finite, rational agents, neither gods nor animals, but something unique and precious in between, offered perspectives on technological development that could avoid both uncritical enthusiasm and reactionary rejection. The commitment to treating persons as ends in themselves rather than mere means provided moral frameworks for evaluating new technologies according to their effects on human flourishing rather than simply their efficiency or profitability. Perhaps most importantly, Kant's example continued to demonstrate that philosophical thinking was not a luxury for academic specialists, but a practical necessity for anyone who sought to live thoughtfully in a complex and rapidly changing world. The questions he had asked about the nature of knowledge, the foundations of morality, and the possibilities for human progress remained unavoidable for each new generation, even though the specific contexts in which those questions arose continued to evolve in unexpected ways. The quiet professor, who had never travelled more than 60 miles from his birthplace, had indeed sent his ideas across continents and centuries, transforming how human beings understood themselves and their possibilities. His revolution in human self-understanding continued to unfold in ways he could never have anticipated, but would surely have appreciated, as new generations of thinkers took up the work of rational inquiry that he had shown was both humanity's greatest challenge and its most distinctive achievement. In university classrooms and research laboratories, in political movements and artistic endeavours, in the private reflections of individuals grappling with fundamental life choices, the spirit of critical philosophy lived on. Not as a fixed doctrine to be memorized and repeated, but as a method of thinking that could be applied to whatever questions human beings found themselves confronting in their ongoing attempts to understand themselves and their place in the cosmos. The boy who had been born into a world of traditional certainties and inherited authorities had grown up to show that human beings could think for themselves about the deepest questions of existence without falling into either dogmatic arrogance or paralyzing skepticism. His legacy was not any particular answer to those questions, but rather the demonstration that asking them honestly and systematically was both possible and necessary for anyone who sought to live a fully rational and moral life. And in that demonstration, the influence of Immanuel Kant would continue to shape human thought as long as human beings continued to wonder about themselves and their possibilities in an uncertain but meaningful universe. The death of Immanuel Kant marked not an ending but a transformation, as his ideas began their long journey through time, adapting and evolving with each generation that encountered them. Within the quiet study where he had spent his final years, surrounded by the accumulation of 8 decades of systematic thinking, his personal effects told the story of a mind that had never ceased its restless inquiry. His library contained works in multiple languages, margins filled with careful annotations that revealed an intellect constantly engaging with new ideas, even as it developed its own revolutionary framework. His servants found notebooks filled with fragmentary thoughts about questions that had occupied him until the very end, sketches for essays on the nature of laughter, reflections on the relationship between genius and mental illness, observations about the effects of climate on human character. These scattered insights revealed a thinker whose curiosity had extended into every corner of human experience, someone who believed that philosophy should illuminate the ordinary as much as the extraordinary. The immediate practical question facing his executors was what to do with this vast intellectual inheritance. Kant had left careful instructions about his financial affairs, modest though they were, but he had said little about the disposition of his manuscripts and unpublished writings. Some were clearly intended for publication, while others appeared to be private exercises in thinking through difficult problems. Still others consisted of lecture notes that had been refined through decades of classroom use, but never prepared for a reading public. The decision was made to preserve everything, recognizing that even Kant's most tentative and incomplete thoughts might prove valuable to future scholars seeking to understand the development of his ideas. This choice reflected a new understanding of intellectual work that Kant himself had helped to establish. Ideas were not private property, but contributions to a common human enterprise that transcended the lives of their individual creators. The first systematic edition of Kant's works began appearing within a decade of his death, but the editors quickly discovered that organizing his intellectual output was far more complex than they had anticipated. His 3 major critiques form the obvious core of the system, but how should they be related to his earlier writings his essays on political and historical topics, his extensive correspondence with other philosophers, and his unpublished fragments on subjects ranging from pedagogy to meteorology. And so we return to where we began, with questions that refuse to remain buried. Kant's life reminds us that the most profound revolutions often happen not on battlefields or in palace halls, but in the quiet corners of ordinary existence, where minds willing to think without limits encounter the deepest mysteries of human experience. His legacy lives not in monuments or institutions, but in every moment when someone stops to ask what we can truly know, how we should really live, and whether human beings can actually create a more just world through reason and moral courage.